Here to talk to you about osmosis. In all the different types of membrane transport we have, osmosis is a passive process, does not require any energy, so it falls into that category and really involves the movement of water across the cell membrane. So here's our cell again. The yellow border is the cell membrane or plasma membrane around the cell. Now, osmosis involves the movement of water, which I'll use these blue beads to symbolize. And we also have to have some sort of solute. So I'm going to use the red beads to symbolize sodium ions. Water, as we should know, vastly outnumbers the other solutes in a living system. Our body is well over half water. So we have lots of water inside and outside of the cell. So if all these are water molecules, then they're free to move around inside the cell. They can move through the membrane in a couple of ways. One is simple diffusion. They can slip through. They're small enough that they can move right through the membrane. There are also small channels that the cell can use to facilitate the movement of water. So if the cell wants more water to move through, then it will put in a channel called an aquaporin. So the more aquaporins we have, the more water can move through. I'm not going to draw them on the rest of the cell membrane, but we can assume that this water is moving around freely in and out of the cell. So what causes water to move? Well, the cell does not have a little water pump. The aquaporins are passive. They just allow water to come in and go in and out as it pleases, but there's no pump. The phrase water follows salt is fairly helpful. If we add some salt inside the cell, some sodium to be more accurate, then water tends to follow that. Water, seeking its most stable state, will surround these sodium ions. Because water is a polar molecule and kind of likes to hang out with the sodium, and so that will cause water to move into the cell. Now, sodium is not found only in the cell. In fact, the cell tends to actively pump sodium out. I'm not showing it here, but there are different pumps, one of which is the sodium-potassium pump. And if we were to move all the sodium out of the cell, now water is going to be attracted by that and leave the cell. So that's essentially the driving force of osmosis, is following that other solute. So if water were to leave the cell, then this cell would shrink up. If we were to add a bunch of salt, sodium, it could be potassium, it could be a variety of other solutes, it can even be sugar, anything that dissolves in water, then more water is going to come into the cell. In this case, we added a lot of sodium. So the inside of the cell is now going to be packed with water, which is going to push out. An animal cell could even burst that membrane. If you had a plant cell, on the other hand, then outside that membrane you have a cell wall, a somewhat rigid structure, and the pressure of that cell expanding and pushing against this membrane creates a somewhat rigid cell, which is not like what we have in animals. So that means that plant cells are kind of like this. Each cell is rigid, and you can stack them up one on top of another, and the whole plant will stand up on its cells. doesn't have a skeleton standing on its cells. If you were to do something like pump all that sodium out of those cells and the water were to leave, it can escape through the cell walls, then these would get floppy, the cell would fall apart, and the plant would wilt. So osmosis is a very important process in living systems where water follows salt through the membrane, either directly through the membrane or through the aquaporins, but it does not require energy to move the water, so it is a passive process.